Hello, this is a guide to the kayak roll. Um, we'll just have a general look. Um, to actually learn it, it would be best to get direct coaching. So how to learn? Ideally in a pool and with a coach. And I would add, everyone's got their own way of teaching, so sticking with one coach is possibly a good idea, so it doesn't become too confusing. Then on flat water, so move to a river, and then to moving water, more like where you're likely to fall in. And during all this, you'll be developing your technique and the right mindset. So there are various stages. The setup, which is the most important part. The sweep, paddle support and hip flick. Again, hip flick's crucial. And the recovery is what happens as you complete the roll. So the setup. The setup is easy. Okay, that's I think it's also critical. So it must be right. The aim is to have the leading blade to skim on just near the surface during your sweep, and that's achieved by getting the angle right of the blade, so it flies across the water. If the angle's wrong, it'll cause the motion will cause the blade to dive. So in real world, you'll have cold shock as you fall in, and you'll be doing your setup during that time, so you have to allow that moment to pass. You also need to let the boat settle. You can't begin your roll until the boat's fully upside down. There'll be disorientation, it's normal, and that's the point about being taught by the same person using one method, because people do have their own ways of explaining it, and there are different types of rolls. So, set up, lean forward, normal paddle grip. You want the shaft parallel to the boat. You want the leading blade parallel with the surface, so to do that you typically cock your wrist so that the blade angle is catching the water. You push when you're upside down, you're pushing towards the surface, and you want to ideally break the paddle out to the surface. The leading blade above the surface and angled so that it won't dive when you begin your sweep. Now, the backhand is important too, because you must push it up to the surface when you're underwater, so that the shaft clears the underside of the boat. You'll see this later in the video. So the next stage is the sweep. Now the aim, as I say, is to have the blade sweep out wide away from the boat, giving you a wide stance and maximum leverage. Okay, so you ideally would sweep keeping the blade near the surface until the blade is at right angles to your boat, or the shaft's at right angles to your boat, and that's when you're going to have maximum sort of leverage from the paddle. So as the blade is sweeping out from under your boat along the surface, your body should be coming up to that side as well. But crucially, your head should be still down. One way to achieve this is to look along the paddle and watch the leading blade, and then do that the whole way through the roll. So watch the leading blade. The sweep blends into the next stage, where the shaft is in line with your hips. So this is where you're getting, you've gone from your setup, you've completed your sweep, you're leveled with your hips, and now you're going to do two things at once. You're going to pull down on the paddle to get support, but crucially at the same time you're going to do what we call the hip flick, and that's where you basically, on the thigh that's closest to the paddle, So if you're sweeping on your right side, it would be your right leg wants to close the gap between your right leg and your right elbow. So what you're doing is you're rapidly moving your thigh up, and that has the effect of righting the boat. And then the very last thing you do is sit on top of the boat. So the paddle support and hip flick is that stage. So when the shaft wrangle the boat, you pull down, getting support from the paddle. At the same time, you do the hip flick. So you're blending out of the sweep into this two-stage thing, or a simultaneous thing, where you're doing the hip flick and the paddle support. The hip flick is rapidly bringing your elbow on the support side and the knee on the support side towards each other. The result would be the boat rotating upright, followed by the body rotating towards the surface, and the last thing to come out of the water should be your head. The head is the heaviest thing, so you want it to be floating as long as possible and not giving you weight against the rotation. So you achieve that by looking down towards the leading blade and not arcing your head towards the surface, but actually towards the bottom of the river as you come up. It's counterintuitive, but if you achieve that, you then move into recovery. So recovery is where you want to not fall in again. So the aim is to get into the active paddling position as soon as possible, because you're probably still in white water. If the roll is not fully complete, you're partially up, you can use various support strokes to get that last little bit of support. So you may end your roll with the paddle towards the back. So what you can do is rotate your wrist and sculpt the paddle forward and get support on a forward push of the paddle. So to practice the hip flick, using a support, if you're in a pool, it could be the side of the pool, it could be someone else's boat, go fully upside down, close the elbow and knee to rotate. Now this is, you should be putting less in, as you get there, the concept of this combined sort of head down and hip flick. You should find that you're using less and less support from whatever you're holding on to. Keep the head in the water as long as possible, arch your body sideways towards the surface as the body comes up into the air. You'll see this in the videos. Support can be the side of a pool, a kayak nose, a friend's kayak, or you can get paddle floats that will increase the support from the paddle. You put the paddle float over the blade. Now, if you get this really well practiced, then the roll becomes quite easy, the other parts of the roll. So if you can rely on this being correct, and it is possible to practice at the side. So practicing the setup. Okay. So initially you're going to capsize already in the setup position. So with your shaft parallel to the boat and the wrists rotated correctly and so on. Later capsize with your paddle in random positions, forcing you to maneuver your paddle underwater to the setup position, which will be like an actual roll in the river. Later practice with your eyes closed, because again, in a real world situation, maybe within white water, there could be quite a confusing environment. So practicing with your eyes closed helps. Now, the way I think of this setup is as a easy to get to starting position, a known reference point, which eyes closed, upside down, in cold water, in shock, can still get to it. There's nothing difficult about it, but it's very important. Critically get this right, that it sets the blade angle. Okay, so if you rush this or have the angle slightly wrong, then the blade will dive and the roll will fail. So from the setup you move into the sweep. To practice the sweep, the ideal way is to have it in a pool with a friend gently guiding the angle of the blade and maybe supporting it slightly. So, but if you have the angle right, then the support is there. Aim to keep the leading blade near the surface. Again, that will happen if the blade is at the right angle. So push the near hand up. So when you're upside down, right, you're going to push the rear hand towards the surface, and the reason you're doing that is so that the shaft will, and the back blade will clear the underside of the boat. However, as you come up, you want to keep your back elbow close to your body, so that the shaft can stay fairly parallel to the surface of the water. Aim to sweep out away from the boat for maximum leverage. So the further away from the boat you go, your body will come out from under the boat. You'll have maximum leverage. If you try to do everything close to the boat, you will have much less effectiveness. The sweep ends level with your hips and at right angles to the boat. Well, that's the maximum leverage. You'll see some people beginning to roll before they've got to that point. It gives them more range to move the paddle, so there's some advantages, but the maximum leverage is when you're level with your body. So there are many problems. I'll mention a few here because we see them most often, I suppose. So the wrong leading blade angle, if you don't get your setup right, will cause the blade to dive, and then there's no support. So what you'll feel it, okay? You'll feel the blade diving if it's wrong. So if you feel that, then it's not a difficult thing to just go back to the reset position, rotate your wrist slightly to get the blade angle correct, and go again. And that takes a fraction of a second. So it's not worth continuing if that blade is diving. The rear hand is too low, so sometimes the back hand can interfere with the bottom of the boat. So you want to push up towards the surface with the rear hand as well as the front hand, so that you clear the boat. The interference with the underside of the boat can also cause the leading blade to dive. Okay, this is probably the most typical problem, is that when people are learning, is that the head comes out of the water too soon. People are panicking a bit, they want to get a gasp of air, and they tend to bring their head towards the surface. Okay. However, this causes the failure of the roll. So the way it does that is it arches your body in the wrong way, with your head coming towards the surface, and so your leg inside the boat, if you're coming up on the right side, your left leg will engage where it shouldn't, and that will actually cause the boat to flip back down into the water again. You'll see this in the videos, but we see it very often. It's the most common failure problem. So the way to correct it is to bring your head out last, and the way to achieve that is to keep looking at the leading blade, look down along the shaft, even as you come out through the surface into the air. Keep your head towards the water and looking down the shaft. Okay, here's a practice roll, starting with a random position. Okay, so it's all quite fast, so we'll see it in slow motion. So going over in slow motion, the paddle's in a random place. First thing is to move to the setup position as the boat settles. So as the boat's settling, I'm bringing the paddle over to the right position. The blade angle's wrong at the moment, but that's to allow it to move through the water. Now I'm reaching for the surface, it's clear of the surface. Angle's right, I'm beginning the sweep. Keeping the head down, and still looking down along the shaft towards the paddle. Okay, so that is the roll. You'll see it again in full speed. So it's a fluid motion, but obviously that comes from practice. So now we're going to analyze some beginner rolls in a pool. So at this one, the blade angle is good initially, and his body is forward, could be better forward, but it's forward. He's looking at the leading blades, that's good, and he actually holds his position as he goes over, and so he's in the setup position, and if you watch as he goes over, that leading blade will come to the surface and break the surface. So the boat is settling, this takes amount of time, you have to let it settle. So now he's beginning to push up towards the surface, leading hand is pushing up, rear hand is also pushing up. The shaft parallel to the boat, this is all good. His head is a bit up, which isn't so good. So he's now in the right position. He's starting his sweep near the surface, that's good. The angle's good, flying. His head is coming up, but he's beginning to put his head down now, which is good. And he's engaged his hips, and he's flicking the boat over, and his head is down now. So when it mattered, his head was down, so that's good. And he's into the recovery position, forward stroke, and he would be able to continue from there. Okay, so that was a reasonable roll in the practice, and here comes another one. So again, leaning forward, cocking the wrist. The blade angle is good at the start, however she doesn't quite maintain it the whole way through the rotation. Body's well forward, though, that's good. It also protects your face in the river if there's rocks and so on. So watch as the collateral breaks the surface. The leading blade is up now, but the angle is wrong. So the wrist should have been cocked more. It's not totally wrong, but it's not great. The backhand isn't high enough out of the water as well, so it could be higher out of the water. So in position, boat is settled. Starting the sweep. It's diving because of the thing, but she's correcting it now. But it's a good hip flick. Look at the hip flick. It's going. It was a bit soon, but it's happening. So that roll was mostly hip flick. The paddle was less effective because it was too deep. The head was out last, and the hip flick was good, so the roll worked. But much better to get that angle right and get more support from the paddle. So here is one where the roll happened, but it was a failure because the head came out, and I think you'll be able to see that. So going over in the setup position, watch the angle of the leading blade. It's out. It's actually not too bad. Rear hand could be out further, push more to the surface. Now the head is beginning to come up, and the sweep is happening now, and it's near the surface. Oh, it's going down. It's going down. The angle was totally wrong, and the head is reaching to the surface, and out of the surface, the head's up, and falling back in again because the other leg engaged the boat and flicked the boat back over. It's counterintuitive, but you must keep your head down. Here's another beginner learning to roll, going over in the setup position. So on this one, the shaft is parallel with the boat once he settles. So he's getting in position, keeping his position. And if you watch the rear hand, he has to clear the boat. So he's going to push up to the surface, and then he's pushed up, and the blade is clear of the underside of the boat. He begins to sweep, and if you watch the rear hand, you'll see it. Sweep beginning now, and the rear hand is going around the boat, perfect. And but the elbow should be closer to his hips now. It's a bit high, so that left hand could be closer to the body. However, the head did come out last, as you see, and it was a good roll. I mean, it worked. It could be improved, but it worked. So this is the real world, quite unlike the pool. So this is where the mindset comes in, because the actual techniques can be practiced. They're not that difficult, and yet applying them in a real world situation is a whole different thing, mainly in the head. So we're wearing protective gear, so we can afford to be upside down in a river like this. So it's cold, there's strong current, there's rocks. It's crucial that you stay in the boat. Seems obvious, but you sometimes have to very deliberately do that. You have to hold on to your paddle. Again, there could be strong forces, so you must hold on to your paddle. That's the way to do it. That makes all the difference to your day.